What's going on, my fellow Jedi and Padawans? Welcome back to another Jedi gaming video. We are so close to the final shape, so the next 3 days I'm going to give y'all some builds for our Warlock, Titan, and Hunter that I think are going to do very well inside of the final shape, whether it be going through that story, day 1 raid, obviously, depending on how good Prismatic is and the combinations we can do before the World's First and such. That'll be a go-to for sure, and we will have builds out on that, so don't worry, but these are going to be the tried and true builds that'll work for basically any content you can go into, even with the sandbox changes in some of the armor as well as the supers. So first off, we are going to cover our Solar Warlock here with a build that I still think is going to be very good, even though well got absolutely tanked inside of the PvE realm. I think it'll still be viable, but if not, our new super will be what I throw on with this build for sure. But we are going to be using our well for now with a combination of the Trace Rifle, Apex Predator, and Outbreak Perfected on this to go with the build, and the Cenotaph mask, which did also get a little bit of a nerf, if you will. The user can't see the mark on the target from high priority, but those fellow guardians still will, so it's not that big of a nerf in my opinion. But that high priority strategy reloads our portion of the trace rifle that is equipped, as well as damaging vehicle, boss, or champions with a trace rifle marks them. That's the mark I was talking about that you personally won't be able to see, but your fellow fire team members will. When an ally defeats that target, special ammo is dropped for you, so you can get even more back for that trace rifle, and then heavy for our allies, so very good in that end game content. We usually had one of these inside of our pantheons, depending on like Rolk as well as Nezarect. It was very essential to have this so we could have a bunch of ammo. Now in these subclasses, I'm also going to go over the stats that I wanted to build into most, at least my top 3. So for me, I went with recovery on this at 100. That'll be my first one, and then next recovery at second, as high as I could, trying to get it to 100. With the third one, I flip-flopped between intellect as well as that discipline for this build, so again, totally up to you, but I personally like the intellect, especially when that new super comes in. It's going to be disgusting. Now, like I said earlier, we are going to be using Well of Radiance, but we will see depending on how junk it actually is. We're going to be using Healing Rift on this build to get those heals, with Balance Glide, of course, to keep us inside of the jumping puzzles, because I hate the Warlock jump with a passion. Next off, I like Celestial Fire. Is very easy to proc. It gives us that nice energy blast that scorches targets. Very good. I don't like getting up close and personal unless I'm using Sun Bracers and that Incinerator Snap or something along the Dawn Chorus route, which we do have a build with that. Definitely like the Scorch of the Snap a little bit better. As for Grenade, I personally like having the Solar Grenade, but you could go with Healing as well to keep up that restoration and cure. Totally up to you if you're having trouble staying alive. For our 2 aspects, I'm going with Icarus Dash on this so we can get that airborne movement, and then we are also going to go with Touch of Flame, so if you're using Healing Grenade, has improved strength of cure and restoration, as well as if you're using the Solar, it's going to have increased duration as well as emit those blobs of lava, so a little bit more damage as well for that grenade. Moving on to fragments, we got Ember of Benevolence, so applying that restoration, cure, or radiant to guardians grants us grenade, melee, and class ability regeneration for a short time. Going to be able to have our rift, melee, and grenade up a good amount because of this. Second, we're going to be able to have that restoration and radiant stay up consistently via the Ember of Empyrean, because solar weapon or ability final blows extend the duration of those. Third on the list, applying a radiant for us, is going to be that Ember of Torch with the melee. That is why I chose Celestial Fire, so we can get those attacks a little bit more easier and from a farther distance. Then last, we got Ember of Solace, so Radiant and Restoration have longer effects, so it just pairs with everything else to get Radiant, Restoration, Cure, to have some ability spam, keep us healed, as well as with the Cenotaph, you're going to have unlimited ammo for your Trace Rifles, and your fellow Guardians are going to have unlimited heavy. Next on the list is the Dawn Chorus build that I was talking about. Very good for damage, and I think with next season it is going to pair very good with our other super, our new super that we are getting, with the ability for that nice melee to track around scorched targets, as well as giving us that halo of light. Oh, it is going to be so good with that radiance. And then Rites of Ember, like I said, your daybreak projectiles deal more damage and scorched targets on impact. Your scorch is improved and you gain a small amount of melee energy when you scorch damage a target. So it is a very good solar synergy. That new super, I'm pretty sure, is also with the Dawnblade. We just get a little bit different options to it, so this is going to pair very well next season. As for our stats that we went into, first off, I went with recovery and resilience both being at 100. Could switch them on and off, but I would definitely go with recovery as high as you could for your class ability, and then resilience as high as you could for that end game damage resistance. And then my third one was our grenade on this build, because we're going to be getting our snapback very quickly with our aspect. For the super, we got Dawnblade, of course, and then our class ability is actually going to be Phoenix Dive. While Heat Rise is active, we gain Restoration while diving, and we scorch targets upon landing. Very good for curing us as well as our fellow Guardians. Balance Glide is usually what I go for my movement ability on these builds in PvE. Like I said, inside of the Cenotaph build, I like Incinerator Snap because the Scorch is disgusting paired with the Dawn Chorus. Causes a bunch of ignitions and explosions. Definitely one of my favorite. Personally going with the Solar Grenade on this build so we can really stack this out for DPS and damage, getting everything out of the way inside of the final shape. On top of that, our first aspect is going to be that Heat Rises. When we fire weapons, melee, and throw grenades while gliding, we consume that grenade to gain Heat Rises. Allows us to use that Phoenix Dive for healing and Scorch. Plus, when we get kills in the sky while airborne, it grants increased duration to that Heat Rises, plus gives us our melee energy, so hence why we are getting our snapback very quickly. Of course, Touch of Flames, so we're going to have that Solar Grenade have increased duration as well as emitting those lava blobs, so a little bit of extra DPS and Scorch from this on top of what it had before. Quick Fragments, Solar, pretty usual as always. We're going to have Ember of Empyrean, so those weapon final blows or Solar ability final blows extend the duration of Restoration and Radiant, and we're going to be using that consistently on this build. Second is Ember of Ashes, so we apply even more Scorch stacks to targets, pairs, and stacks with the Dawn Chorus, so it is actually crazy for the ignitions and scorches that we are getting on this build. Next is Ember of Searing, defeating those scorched targets gives us even more melee energy, so pairing that with the Heat Rises and those defeats, plus the Fire Sprites, we're getting our grenade back, so it is a beautiful little combination there. And then finally, Ember of Mercy, giving us even more restoration when we pick up those Fire Sprites, as well as when we revive an ally. We all get it, so little combination of healing and damage on this with the Phoenix Dive, Ember of Mercy, Fire Sprites, everything like that, and then the Scorch stacks are absolutely disgusting. Next on the list is a Stasis Cold Snap build with our Osmiomancy gloves. They aren't getting any changes as of now for next season, but there is a bunch of Shatter and Stasis and new fragments that are coming next season, so I'll just throw those up on a screen. Shout out to Blueberries GG for all the infographics that they put out for all of this, expansions, lost sectors, and that they will be tagged down below in the description as well, so go check out their Twitter, their homepage, website, etc. So it is a bunch of changes you can see right here, and I think Stasis is going to be disgusting, so our Hunter has a build as well for it, but this right here with Osmiomancy and those Cold Snap grenades with those turrets is going to be disgusting. So like I said, here is our perk Fervid Cold Snap. Our Cold Snap grenades have an additional charge that recharge quicker on direct impacts, and the Seeker spawn from the Cold Snap travel further, so it pairs very well with having just a bunch of turrets out. You can throw out that first one, then get some nice direct impacts to refill, throw out another one, get a bunch of direct impacts, and then just repeat that cycle. As for our stats that we are going with, number 1 went with Resilience to stay alive. Number 2, I actually went with Discipline for that Cold Snap and having the double Cold snap up consistently, with number 3 being our recovery, so we can have that rift down as much as possible as well. As for our super, obviously we're going to have Winter's Wraith with the healing rift, so we can heal ourselves, stay alive in some of that end game. I actually went with Burst Glide with this, so we can stay out of danger a little bit easier than we would with something like a Solar Warlock and that Icarus Dash. Obviously we got our Perennial Blast, raise the stasis staff against our foes that can freeze them, so we're going to use this for a couple things, giving us even additional Seekers off of this build, plus we can freeze targets like Unstoppables and stun them. Obviously the essential of this build, the Cold Snap Grenade, a grenade that freezes on impact, sends out another Seeker that finds and freezes targets. We're going to use it in 2 different fashions for that, with the direct impacts as well as creating stasis turrets. Those stasis turrets right here are the Bleak Watcher. Press and hold to consume our grenade to turn it into a stasis turret that fires slowing projectiles. Will also freeze targets after a while, so we can stun Overload, keep waves and waves of enemies at bay, as well as stun Unstoppables if it gets hit enough with those slowing projectiles. And with the build of Cold Snap, having those Osmiomancy, you can have about 3 to 4 out before they start to disappear with doing the right rotation. As for our other aspect, Ice Flare Bolts, shattering a stasis frozen target, spawn Seekers that track and freeze to nearby enemies. So since we're going to be using turrets instead of the Cold Snap all the time through on Ice Flares, so we can continuously have that freeze on targets nearby. Very, very good at ad management, keeping crazy rooms apart. So that new strike that the dev talked about, that's going to be insanely hard, this is going to be a great build to keep ads at bay. As for fragments, Whisper of Torment, still going to be using these 4 right here. We gain the grenade energy each time we take a damage from targets. Next, Whisper of Change. With those changes, you can read those, but this is the stats. We get that 10 recovery, and then we're going to get frozen targets and stasis crystals. We take reduced damage when we are near them. Third on the list is Whisper of Fissures. We have increased damage and burst of those stasis crystals, or defeated those frozen targets. With the last but not least, defeating slowed or frozen targets grants us class ability, so this is Whisper of Refraction. Very, very good stasis build for our Warlock. Next on the list is probably going to be a big go-to for me with the Swarmers. Very good with damage. A lot of people were using it at -15 for Pantheon because of that Strand Surge, but Swarmers destroying a Tangle spawns Threadlings. Your Threadlings unravel targets that they damage, so we're getting Unravel with this, as well as a bunch of Threadlings. They are going to be absolutely juiced. Plus, with this build, not much is changing in the Strand side that affects us at all, so it is a good solid build that isn't going to change really much. As for our aspects as well as our stats and fragments, we wanted to go into this with 100 resilience as our number 1, 100 discipline as our number 2 for our nice old Threadling grenade, and then as high as we could get with 100 in the recovery as well, so that'll be our 1, 2, and 3 stats. As for our abilities, we are going to have our nice Needle Storm, of course, with the Healing Rift as our go-to for our class ability. Again, we're going to be using Burst Glide on this since we do not have Icarus Dash. Definitely a go-to for me on my other subclasses. Arcane Needle, another way to unravel targets. Very, very good for creating even more tangles with this build. We're going to be using that Threadling grenade, of course, so when we throw it out, Threadlings will spawn, and with these Swarmers, they are even more better. As for aspects, we got the Weave Walk right here, so we dodge while airborne to consume a melee energy, and we enter this Weave state where we gain some insane damage resistance, plus we can have 5 Threadlings that perch on top of us, which is pretty crazy because of our Nest aspect. That is Weaver's Call right here, so when we cast our Rift, it weaves 3 Threadlings, and it deploys any Threadlings that are perched. So with Weaver's Call, we're going to have 5. Throwing this down on top of that, we're going to have an additional 3, so that's already 8. Then we can throw out a grenade for an additional 3. We're going to have about 11 Threadlings out, if not more, depending on what's going on with Tangles because of this build. So Swarmers is disgusting. As for fragments, we got 3 of them on this build. Evolution, of course, so those Threadlings move even further and deal additional damage, allows us to have even more badass Threadlings with the Swarmers. Second on the list, we're going to have that Thread of Rebirth. So Strand Weapon Final Blows have chances to create even more Threadlings. So of course, we're building it into as many Threadlings as we can possibly have. With last but not least, of course, the Thread of Generation. So we deal damage, we get grenade energy back, so we can spam that Threadling grenade as much as possible. Because like I said, this build is built all around those Threadlings and doing stranded damage, creating as much as we possibly can. Sever, Unravel, using those for tangles. So very, very good at ad management as well as damage, like I said, especially when there's something like a Strand Surge. Now our last two builds are going to be a little similar in my opinion, using the Geomags as well as the Fallen Sunstars. Very similar in their aspects and fragments as well, but nothing too crazy for changing on the arc side of things. For Warlock, Ball Lightning, we're getting a little bit of the final detonation volume, so it's going to have a larger explosion. Chain Lightning, which I think I will personally use on this build, or even on the Fallen Sunstar, we get that secondary chain, has double damage, so it's going to be very good for knocking out enemies. And then a little changes to our fragments with Recharge, Beacon, and Frequency. A little bit of stability for Frequency. Activates on power weapon defeats as well amplified for Beacon. And then Spark of Recharge, our ability recharge, now persists until the Fold Shield is recharged. So as for the two arc exotics that we are going to be using on this, we got Geomag Stabilizers, so close enough. Damaging targets with Chaos Reach extends the duration, as well as collecting Ionic Traces grant us Chaos Reach. So we are going to be building this out for as many of those Ionic Traces as possible. On top of that, almost the same kind of thing for the Fallen Sunstar. Ionic Conduction. Ionic Traces you create move faster. We gain ability energy from creating those. Nearby allies also gain ability energy when we collect Ionic Traces. So this will be our melee, super, our grenade, as well as our rift. It won't be as substantial as the super energy that we get from Geomags, but it will be an ability spam build for sure with Fallen Sunstar. And then with Geomags, we're going to be able to spam Chaos Reach a little bit more than we would with Fallen Sunstar. As for our abilities, aspects, and fragments on this, like I said, they are going to be very, very much the same because of the way these are built out. Obviously, for Geomags, we're going to have to use Chaos Reach for that ability to spam it and the Ionic Traces, filling this up. For the Fallen Sunstar, if you really wanted to, you could use the Storm Trace, but I personally still like Chaos Reach a little bit better as an Arc Super. As for the stats we're going into, me personally, I went with 100 Resilience as our number 1, 100 Recovery as our number 2, and then for the other one, I personally like 100 in the Intellect as our number 3, just because we're going to be able to spawn the abilities very easily on the Falling Sunstar, and then Chaos Reach, you get it back even faster when it's at 100, so we can just spam it, add clear stun stuff with that jolting, so that is what I would go with. As for our abilities on these last two builds, Healing Rift on both of them. With that Strafe Glide, you could use a Burst Glide if you would like, because we don't have Icarus Dash. Now, like I said, I'm going to be using Chain Lightning on this because of that nice double damage on the second jolt of it and second chain, and while amplified, it creates an additional set of chains, so it's going to be even more disgusting when we are amplified, but that burst with the Ball Lightning might be nice as well. Personally, I really like the Pulse Grenades, especially since with the aspects, you will see why. The more damage we do with them, the more Ionic Traces that we are going to get. Arc Soul is super important because this counts as an arc ability, and with those Arc Souls will amplify, they're going to be supercharged, increased rate of fire. We are going to be able to wipe out enemies very easily with this, plus create a bunch of Ionic charges with the Arc Soul. Now, second, Electrostatic Mind, defeating charges with those arc abilities, like I said, or defeating jolted or blinded targets create us Ionic Traces. Collecting Ionic Traces make us amplified, so this will play back into the Arc Souls for making them faster, plus all the defeats with them are going to create even more of those Ionic Traces, then that Chain Lightning as well as the Pulse Grenade helping even more. As for our Fragment Spark Recharge, like I said, when critically wounded, our melee and grenade recharge more quickly, so that is why I also went with that Intellect being at 100. Like I said, for those changes, it's only going to go up to the max charge rate, which will finish once it's fully charges. Next off, we're going to have Spark of Amplitude. When we rapidly defeat targets while we are amplified, we create orbs of power. Very easy with this build since we are going to be amplified consistently with both of those, especially since we're going to create all those ionic traces. Next off for the build, we're going to have Shock right here with the Spark giving us Jolt on targets for our arc grenades. Why I also want that pulse grenade up as often as possible, and it gives off a bunch of jolting. That's very important because our melee does as well, and defeating those jolted targets will create even more ionic traces for us, so collecting those again with Geomags is going to give us our chaos reach back even faster, and then our abilities back even faster for that falling Sunstar. So two very, very good arc builds at the end. You can kind of mix and match your arc fragments, totally up to you, depending on your gameplay as well as which of the builds you're using, but definitely make as many ionic traces as you can with both of those builds. So again, I truly, truly appreciate all you guys for coming back to the channel. We are so close to the final shape. Hopefully y'all like these builds. We got a Titan video just like this coming out tomorrow for y'all on those builds that I'm taking in on my Titan, and then finishing up on Saturday with y'all Hunter. So be on the lookout for all of those. Like and subscribe helps me out, helps out the channel. Slap that bell if you haven't so you guys can get those notifications on the builds that we are making, as well as on all the new content we are going to get inside of the final shape. So again, truly appreciate you guys. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.